a panel on global value chains fostering inclusive economic development in the Global South. This is being organized by Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RIS New Delhi, which is the co-organizer of our global conclave. To take the proceedings further, I invite Amanat Singh of RIS to introduce the guests and the panelists and the dignitaries on the dais.
A very good evening, everyone. Since we are already quite delayed, I won't take much of the time, and I'll try to give a brief introduction of the panelists. The session on global value chains fostering inclusive economic development in the Global South will be chaired by Professor Rajat Nag, who is concurrently working as a distinguished professor at the Advanced Study Institute of Asia, and he is also working as a distinguished professor at the Emerging Markets Forum, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. And his basic area of interest lies in insights into key development challenges relevant to Asia and sustainable development along with regional cooperation issues in Asia. The panel also comprises of Professor Kimura, who is part of the Faculty of Economics, Keio University, Tokyo, since 2000, and is also the chief economist at the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia in Jakarta since 2008. His main areas of interest are production networks, economic integration, and digital economy in East Asia. We also have Professor Mustafizur Rahman with us, who is currently working as a distinguished fellow at CPD Dhaka, where he previously served as the executive director. His recent works have focused on LDC graduation challenges and regional and global integration of Bangladesh. Further, we have Professor Piti Gala with us, who is an honorary fellow at the InReach Economics Institute with over 30 years of experience in trade and development in international organizations such as World Bank, USAID, and EU. His research interests lie in regional integration, export competitiveness, and regional and global value chains. Next in our panel, we have Professor Ganeshan Vignaraja, who is a visiting senior fellow at ODI in London and an advisor to the Sri Lankan President on strategic trade policy. He is also an adjunct senior fellow at RIS and the professorial fellow in economics and trade in Gateway House. And he, of course, his research interests lie on trade, macroeconomics, and economic development. Lastly, we have Professor S.K. Mohanty with us, who is serving as a professor at RIS. His major work has focused on global and regional trade dynamics, encompassing regionalism, multilateralism, and a range of international trade issues, including complexities of manufacturing GVCs, agricultural trade, and technology-intensive trade. So I now request Professor Nag to steer the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanat. Co-panelists, I hope you realize that this is the last session of a very intense day, and dinner beckons. So no matter what happens, I've been told by the organizers, we have to finish at 7:55 so that you can walk to the fountain lawns at 8. Okay. So with that, I'm sure we'll meet that deadline. I'm excited to be here, not only because of the topic, not only because of all of you, but because of my co-panelists, many of whom, of course, I worked with for a long time, and it's always such a pleasure. And I'll just do a bit of a timekeeping or a housekeeping exercise for all of you. We will not have 2 hours, as we thought we would, so that's out. If I may request, if we keep 10 to 12 minutes each, which really means you'll take 12. I've given a range, but that's okay. Because I would like to leave some time and a good 20 to 30 minutes for the audience to interact with us. I'll try to keep my interventions minimum or as a part of the discussions, and I'll try to finish by 7:55. Huh? So 10 to 12 minutes. Let's start with Professor Kimura. You have heard about him. You can read about him. But I want to just bring one issue up, and of course you'll have many more. I was struck by the abstract that you submitted, Professor Kimura, and it says, globalization is not dead yet. as opposed to the public belief in some advanced countries. I'm so pleased to hear that. And I think, as you rightly point out, it's up to us to say what will keep it going. Because I think the benefits of globalization are for all to see, but there are challenges. And I think, and most of us I would term as globalists, the mistake we have made is that we've assumed, because we know it's good, that everybody else will agree, particularly in the political scene. Therefore, I was very struck with your comment, and I look forward to hearing from you about that. You also make a very interesting point about the third unbundling. And to me, for South Asia, that is an area of major comparative advantage. Huh? So, Professor Kimura, if I may, in the context of in the course of your talk, if you talk a bit also about how can the Global South take advantage of the globalization on the third unbundling. That is the third frontier. And the first two are now sort of done, and we've seen the benefits of it. The third for us in the South offers a great potential, but I have to say also maybe greatest risks. So with that, Professor Kimura, 10 to 12 minutes for you, please. Thank you.
Thank you for a great introduction. I cannot speak as fast as Indian people, so I have to cut some materials. But I'm very fortunate that I can do another talk before dinner. So I think maybe some continuation is going there. So I think how to utilize the globalization forces for economic development. I think this is a very, very important topic for everybody. The things are quite different from what 50 years ago. Say in Japan, Korea, Taiwan made a sort of a big step 50 years ago. At that time, globalization was not there yet. But now, so we are really having globalization. Globalization is really supported by technological progress. So the way of doing for the international division of labor is really changing very rapidly. So one really qualitative change is from industry by industry division of labor. We did that from the 19th century, actually. But we're going to step into task by task division of labor in the wording of the Richard Baldwin called the second unbundling. Mainly in machinery industries, but some part of, say, garment industries doing just-in-time type things, and maybe some part of BPO in digital businesses are doing this kind of operations in a sense. Then we have person-by-person division of labor, so more and more finer fragmentation of activities is going on across national border. So far, we know how to deal with task by task because we have a lot of experience in East Asia now. And then I'm pretty sure that the other parts of the world, including South Asia, can join us using this kind of division of labor, definitely. And then third unbundling. The chairman said that I have to say something. I'm not sure still how we can depend on that. If we see the statistics, in case of India, of course, you are doing many things and you are really exploring a sort of new path probably. But if we just measure the digitalized services trade, that is still relatively quantitatively limited in the world. So how far we can depend on that as a sort of a core part of development strategies for all countries. So that, I'm not quite sure, actually. So that's a sort of conclusion that I have to say that. So I've already spent 3-4 minutes, I guess. So first unbundling, second unbundling, third unbundling, what moves, then what is the typical industries and what sort of policies are needed. Those are pretty much well organized already, so we observe that. And then talking about the second unbundling first, Actually, only the very limited number of countries has been successful in doing this so far. China, ASEAN, and then some East European countries, and Mexico. They are doing that, but other countries are still not really joining this type of division of labor. But there are a bunch of good properties. One is this is a further utilization of location advantages. So more people can get jobs, and particularly in the case of manufacturing and related supporting services, we are giving jobs for relatively less educated people. So actually, poverty alleviation is much faster in East Asia because of that, I think. And also we have many chances of technology transfer spillover. We have a fragmentation of production, but if one factory is set up, various kinds of tasks are coming together. So that generates a lot of opportunities for technology transfer spillovers, particularly the business relationship between foreign affiliates and local companies. I think that's a very important channel for technology transfer spillover. And required policies, we need enhanced mobility. So starting from overall trade liberalization and facilitation, if you check policies in ASEAN, they are doing trade facilitation very seriously. Tariffs are zero for more than 99% of the commodities already inside ASEAN. But in addition to that, various kinds of trade facilitation is over there. And also standard and conformance, so how to harmonize those. They are very serious about those kind of things. And then logistics infrastructure. I'm very happy to hear sort of news of a port construction in Bangladesh recently. I think that changes logistics infrastructure a lot. We need those kind of things. And then we need supplementary policies to strengthen local advantages, because we'd like to have some thickness in industry. So fragmentation of production at the same time, forming agglomeration at the same time. Otherwise, we cannot really have a sort of a stable industrial structure, and also having a sort of generating good jobs and upgrading our position inside value chains. And this kind of model is really proved to be one of the very effective development strategies to reach the high income level. For example, Malaysia is coming to high income level in a year or two now. And then Vietnam, Indonesia is having a very strong aspiration to step into high income. So that's a story and some interesting figures, but I skipped that, sorry. I'd like to have a little bit more recent things in, I call it international production networks. This is a task-by-task international division of labor. That's what I mean that. So it's a sort of a subset of global value chains. So it is true, so with COVID-19, people criticized the fragility of global value chains very harshly. But I think that do they really see the trade statistics? So if you see trade statistics, then actually production networks, particularly in machinery industry, were very robust and also resilient. And that happened in history too. So in case of Asian currency crisis, global financial crisis, East Japan earthquake, Thailand flooding. So regardless of those natural disasters or man-made disasters, actually the international production networks are very robust and resilient compared with other types of international transactions. So in case of COVID-19, provided three kinds of shocks to global value chains. One is negative supply shocks, say some parts and components are not coming from China, for example. Then negative demand shocks, so economies are slowing down, so we have a sort of negative demand shock from downstream. The other is positive demand shocks. So because of COVID, people should work at home. Then we have to have a sort of big displays and good office chairs. Those are generating a lot of demand. In case of Japan, the husband at home, then we need actually dishwashers. Otherwise, we have a big problem at home. Okay? So those are sort of positive demand shocks coming from COVID-19. So in case of, say, machinery exports to the world during COVID-19, particularly in case of East Asia, these are exports of machinery. So by East Asia, by North America, by Europe. You can see that this index as sort of each month of 2019 is equal to 1. So above 1 means that this is higher than the last year. So you can see 1 year before. So in case of East Asia, below 1 is a very, very short, actually. It's coming back and then grow. So that's quite different from North America and Europe, actually. So that's what I have to say about a sort of criticism on the fragility of global value chains. Some global value chains are fragile, yes, but in case of machinery production networks, those are pretty robust and resilient. Okay, last one. Concerns over geopolitical tensions. I'm stationed in Tokyo and Jakarta, and particularly in Tokyo, I put a lot of pressure as an economist. Now the voices of national security persons are so strong, so economists are not called for important policy discussion. So really a sort of a weird situation. Then machinery production networks are at the center of turmoil caused by current geopolitical tensions, particularly the US-China technology competition. However, yeah, okay, great, 2 minutes. Recent work by me is trying to empirically measure the trade effects of US-led export controls, particularly for high-tech products. Right? So the US is doing many things, and finally Japan and also the Netherlands are cooperated with each other, and we are doing export controls for semiconductor manufacturing equipment. So then people are thinking that now so global value chains are really separated, completely decoupled very soon, but it's not quite true. Actually, the effects are very minimal at the really finely classified products level, not even industry level or macro level, actually. And also, third countries, including ASEAN, certainly India too, are generally out of the scope of the extraterritoriality of the US export controls. US export controls are going to beyond the national border. If we are using US technologies, then we have to ask US government that can we really export this to such and such countries, actually. But those are not really, the scope is not really covered. So in the case of trade in the third countries, basically, they rather enjoy trade investment diversion by tariff war. So typically Vietnam and Mexico. So there are many chances to utilize this kind of opportunities. It's not a really pleasant days, but so far, so that's the situation. So I just claim, just 20 seconds, rule-based trading regimes is very important. We have to have some predictable environment. Otherwise, that kind of fine-tuning production networks cannot be extended. So this is very important. So now the Global South can utilize machinery IPNs but that's a necessary condition is a rule-based trading regime. So the concern is a possible collapse now of the rule-based trading regime. G7 and China implement a series of policies that may not be consistent with the rule-based trading regime. So they are not really protecting that kind of regime now. So the Global South must be proactive in protecting that kind of regime. So I know that the countries are country by country doing some small cheating. I know some India's case too. But that's a small cheating. We do not want to have the total collapse of the regime. So and also I know that some people are not happy about the current rules. I understand that, but now the protection of the regime is a timing that we really have to do that. So the last page is differences. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kimura. I'm sorry we had to rush you, but the only consolation is that we'll hear you again in a little while at dinner. So look forward to that. Kimura-san, you made a very good point that you think from the third unbundling we might not get much, obviously, in terms of many countries participating. But what I think would be interesting to get your thoughts later is, so what does the Global South do? Obviously, human capital development is going to be very key. Obviously, skills development is going to be very key. So the question is, how do we build it? Because we are into the digital era, no question about it. So that's where we have to be. And if this globalization is going to be beneficial for all, then we can't obviously not participate in the third unbundling. So I'd be very grateful for your thoughts on that later. I was struck by your last point that you had there in which you said, Global South must be proactive in protecting the rule-based trading regimes. No question, absolutely. Which very interestingly is a perfect segue for me to turn to Dr. Rahman, because in his paper, he makes a point, the nature of GVCs in the South could be made cooperational rather than transactional. And enlightened self-interest should guide South-South cooperation. Great idea, but what I found in many of the negotiation, that these lofty ideas about enlightened self-interest, the first word gets dropped, very understandably. So I think it would be great to hear from you about this question of incidence of benefits and costs, which are, of course, asymmetrical.
Thank you.
And his experience in Bangladesh, I think, is a very relevant one. So, Dr. Rahman, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening. Let me first of all register my deep appreciation to RIS for this opportunity. And Chair, you have already indicated that I take a bit of a different perspective on globalization. My title is Reframing Global Value Chains, Fostering Inclusive Economic Development in the Global South. So I think that not everything is well and good in the kingdom of globalization. Because we not only should talk about rule-based globalization, we should also talk about the value chains and the distribution of value along the value chains. I think time has come to talk about that as well. We are living in the era of SDGs. If we really mean SDGs, and SDGs 17 talk of global partnership, and SDGs 17.10 talk of raising the share of low-income countries from 1% to 2% of the global trade. And we are still, after 8 years, almost 1% of the global trade. So I think that we should talk about how the value along the value chains is being distributed. We know that increasingly over the last few decades, the value chains global value chains are dominating the global trade. Only 30% of global trade is done from, raw materials to the finished and is exported to the consumers. Rest 70% passes through various countries and various production points. So 70% passes through either regional or global value chains. If that be the case, then time has come to look at what is the distributive justice along this value chain. Now, I will take one example. Bangladesh, obviously, you know that it is second largest exporter of apparels in the world. And we have heard about trading out of poverty. And if you look at the minimum wage in the ready-made garment sector in Bangladesh, if you are two of you are working in the ready-made garments and you have two children, 4 family members, if you divide the minimum wage by 4, it is lower than Bangladesh's poverty level income. So with that, you don't trade out of poverty. Now, when we talk about global value chains, it is also about what type of value chains we are seeing. If you look at apparels, and there are many other items, you'll see that these are buyer-driven value chains. If you look at Bangladesh, we see that the major buyers, they are dictating the price of the labor, they are dictating the price of the final products that we are sending. We do have backward linkages. For example, we import cotton yarn fabrics from India and China, but the forward linkage is absolutely controlled by global buyers and brands. And there, if you look at what is the weight share in the total retail price, we have estimated 7 to 8% of the global retail price, which is given as wages. Now, if you look at the share of wages in the GDP in all our countries, it is decreasing, isn't it? Inequality is increasing. So I think that whilst we talk about export-oriented growth, we talk about globalization and the value chains, participation in value chains, we talk about trade liberalization, trade facilitation, logistics. Yes, we will have to do that. Upstream and downstream, we should facilitate trade, but the distribution of the value along the value chain should also be of concern to us. When Rana Plaza disaster happened in Bangladesh, the only brand which came up with some financial support for the 1,200 workers who died was Primark. No other brand and buyer came up, but they went for compliance requirements, etc. Yes, required, obviously. We should comply with the labor standards and the safety of the laborers and the structure. But there was no support. When they come to countries like ours, there are sourcing people and there are buying people. The sourcing people will come and see whether it is the factory or the enterprises, these are complying, etc., etc. But when the buying people come, they go for the lowest price. So this hypocrisy between ethical sourcing and ethical buying is also something that we should talk about, I think. For example, Bangladesh has 7 of the 10 platinum accredited ready-made garments factories, knitwear, in the world. But when they invest in compliance in environment, we don't see the reflection of that in the prices. So our entrepreneurs who have invested in compliance, in CO2 emission reduction, etc., the prices are not reflecting that investment. So there, I think, when you talk about the Center for Global South and Dakhin, I think that time has come that we should also see what are the avenues of cooperation amongst the countries of the Global South so that we can enhance our value share in the value chains through South-South cooperation. And there, I think that there are a lot of avenues. For example, technology transfer. Technology productivity is becoming very important, we know that, but if you look at the TRIPS regime, trade-related intellectual property rights, very restrictive. So through South-South cooperation, if we can have facilitated technology transfer, then we can have higher productivity and perhaps then we can have a higher share in the value chain. Also, I think that the forward linkages within the southern countries is also another opportunity for us. India imports about $750 billion. China imports about $2,800 million every year, but we are not being able to export to these markets. So I think that greater cooperation amongst our countries through triangulation of now transport connectivity, investment, and trade, I think can offer us better value and also better share in the southern value chains. I think this is very important as we talk about South-South cooperation. We are now, for example, with India, we are now thinking about, for example, a comprehensive economic partnership agreement. So it is just not trade liberalization. It is also investment. It is also market. It is based on that and multimodal connectivity, the trade, cooperation in trade. So I think that southern cooperation could be different, not transactional, as the chair reminded me. It is not my word, it is my friend Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi's word, spoken about 5 years back, that it should not be transactional but cooperational. The other point that I think is very important, you see, as of now, trade in goods and trade in services are very closely entwined. If we want to raise our share in the value chain, forward linkages are very important. Now, for forward linkage, you need commercial presence, isn't it? But if you look at the global trading regime, only talk about liberalization of trade in goods. What happens to the liberalization of trade in services? What happens to movement of natural persons? GATS Mode 4, which we have been discussing since my grandmother's days, but nothing. So we always ask, how can trade be free if it is not fair? You have advantage in services, but you protect your market. I cannot go to that market, open a shop, etc. Lot of difficulties. I am not going for migration. It is commercial presence, movement of natural person to provide a service. It is forward linkage. So I think that these are the issues which, as a global south, we should raise in the WTO. There will be ministerial conference of the WTO in the last week of February in Abu Dhabi, 13th ministerial conference. I think that global south should raise these type of issues. Technology transfer, movement of natural persons, so that we can have better share through the forward linkages. So I think that yes, globalization is a process that we cannot stop. It is irreversible, but we should think about what type of globalization we are talking about. Is it inclusive? Is it distributive? Is the distributive justice there? I think that this is also something that we should think about, and deeper cooperation amongst the countries of Global South can not only help us deepen South-South cooperation, but also help us to go into the process of globalization from a position of strength, building on the advantages of South-South cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Rahman, I'm so pleased to hear you bring up specifically and explicitly the question of distributive justice, because ultimately that's what it's all about. I think there is no disagreement that globalization is good overall. It's the question of the incidence of benefits and the distribution of benefits. Having said that, and I fully agree with the points you have made and the slow progress when it comes to this incidence of benefits and costs, the only thing I at least want to remind myself, taking from Kirmura-san's point, that the answer to that, I hope, will not become closing the doors and withdrawing behind borders, because that is the risk, and that's what you see all over the world, and understandably so. I understand why people lose their jobs, therefore stop the trade. To me, the concept of open regionalism is really, you cannot afford to have a fortress Asia, fortress South Asia. What we have to do is, of course, have more intra-South Asia trade, intra-South Asia cooperation, which actually, I'm sure the organizers planned it this way. I found it beautiful how each of the papers segues beautifully into the other, which brings me to the next speaker, Dr. Pitigala Nihal. You will be speaking a bit more specifically about the need for inclusive development, because ultimately globalization is no good if the people don't benefit. I think that's the point that Dr. Rahman was making, and Nihal will expand on that. Nihal.
Thank you, distinguished chair and the distinguished panel and friends. I wish I made this presentation at the end so I know how many slides I need to avoid, having the Nash equilibrium of guessing which ones to do. But I certainly welcome.
I presume we'll get a copy of all these slides. Knowledge there.
I welcome the opportunity, and I would like to do the orthodoxy at the beginning for about 5 minutes, and then become like a civil society organization perspective of, because it's about the entire conundrum is about the governance, in my perspective, as far as inclusiveness is concerned. So what is inclusiveness? Inclusiveness means more developing countries meaningfully engaged, and more value is created within developing countries. More SMEs engage, because as we know, SMEs dominate the output and employment in most of the countries, and more so in developing countries. And there's a new agenda emerging that we call it diversity, inclusion, and equity. Gender, women, youth, and some parts of the world, this is very sensitive, but I think it's need to be said, LGBTQ. So just to get out of context, I want to say that about 5 years ago, there was an article in Forbes magazine basically cautioning the Wall Street Journal and the readers that there is this new trend that is emerging in governance of trade and commerce, which is to do with the inclusion. So now we are at this 21st century basically trying to see how best to balance out gains that we seem to have had over the last 10 years, basically because of the rise of GVC. Now, I'm not going to repeat these charts and elaborate on them, but simply to say it's impossible to give a very definitive answer whether GVC is good or bad for a sustainable trade. Because it's a reality, it's a complex, there's a complex set of actors, a complex set of environments that the multinational companies, the local firms deal with. But it's good enough to say that there is a way that GVC can be inclusive if the right measures are taken, and that requires a multiple level of effort from both multinationals, local governments, and NGO. This basically sums up the story of where we are at. This chart basically shows how countries participate in GVC. If you look at the African continent, they're basically subsuming to providing commodities or high commodities. And you see this blue, light blue colored, where the countries have got into limited manufacturing. And thankfully, India, among others, are in the ascending towards high manufacturing sectors. And the most important thing I want to the point I want to raise is the innovative activities are still taking place in OECD countries, in most of the developed countries. And this chart is very interesting to me. Over the corner to the left, it's not dust. It's this developing countries where they are at in this whole game. And you look at across in the vertical, it's the compound growth of the GVCs over the last 19 years. If you look at it, advanced countries still dominate. They are far in the corner. An interesting outlier is China, and I would say also India. And this intensity of growth, which is on the vertical axis shows that some of the developing countries have managed to break out and now are emerging very strongly. Okay, so what has happened over the last 15 years in this interesting conundrum about GVC is these markups of the GVCs have largely gone to the developed countries. Their markups have gone up. The markups of developing countries and least developing countries have gone down over time. Now, that benefit has not even translated into the consumers. They have not been shared with the consumers. There is roughly about 40% cost reduction coming from developing and least developing countries, basically from component parts, textile garments, the usual suspect in GVC trade. That has not been passed on to the consumer. What happens is the nature of trade is that the exposure to technological change, usually the reallocation of value added actually favors labor to capital. So this raises inequality, and it has the potential to increase the skill premium for skilled labor. And that's what the nature of GVC trade has become. And the other reason that GVC markets are non-competitive. They are usually monopolies, and they are also exercise monopoly power. So this dichotomy is where the GVC participation is. But having said that, all is not doom and gloom. This chart basically says that, for example, SMEs over the last between 2000 and 2022 has increased their participation. But the larger countries in developing countries, the larger corporations, larger firms have even done much better. In terms of, you mentioned about the backward integration and forward integration. I truly agree with Professor Rasman. The forward integration is extremely important. Most of the developing countries are still at the backward integration stage. You see all this clustering on the left side of the corner, which basically says they are low in even both backward integration. Their integration intensity is not as good as even the middle, high income countries to a great extent. But having said that, in developed countries, the small firms, the medium-sized firms are doing far better. They are integrated much more than in the small countries, in these developed countries. One of the other thing I wanted to say quickly is about the gender wage gap. Generally, what has happened over time is GVC certainly has helped women engage in work, meaningful work, gainful work, has been rewarded. It's across a lot of countries, from Bangladesh to China to Indonesia. But there's one thing that has happened is GVC firms generally tend to employ more women. It provides conducive environment to employ women, but the gender wage gap between men and women is generally tend to be wider, especially in managerial jobs, high professional jobs. When you talk about the inclusion, these are important. Part of the reason is, if you think about it, COVID-19 and post-COVID-19, generally corporations tend to favor men because they can stay at long at work. They can travel at night and travel at short notice. That sort of bias this gender parity between men and women when it comes to GVC, especially in professional jobs. And also the input, where inputs are sourced, there is a little bit of inherent bias against gender. Now, how did we get here? This is the crust of my presentation. I think I try to limit my time, but this is where I think it's very important to understand. There are a number of governance structures that's out there in GVCs. There's market structure, which is very loose relationship between buyer and seller. There's a modular relationship. There is a captive relationship. There's a hierarchical relationship. Why does this matter? Because generally, it sets the relationships. It's a loose institutional relationship between two parties or more parties, but the rules are generally set by one party. In this case, it happens to be the multinational corporations. The parameters set by multinational corporations. So when you have that scenario, what happens is the control is generally governed by the multinationals or the lead firm, mostly from the West. The coordination of the activities are carried out by the lead firm. They set the parameters, and usually the local firm follows those parameters. What is the orientation? Now we know that this is an important inconvenient truth, because most of the corporates, their ultimate objective is efficiency. The idea is to reduce the costs, raise quality, increase speed. And therefore, that inherently, structurally doesn't favor smaller firms, and especially smaller firms in developing countries. So how do we go about trying to get some balance, which Professor Kimura and Professor Mustafir alluded to? There's not likely going to be a silver bullet for this. It's going to require actors, especially the multinationals, the local suppliers, the local SMEs, and influencers, which I call influencers, the civil societies, the DFIs, the donors, and other international institutes. And there are actions needs to be taken. So this is a multi-dimensional and multi-actor approach, which actions require commitments, investment, rules and standards, upgrading capacity, transparency, accountability, and collaboration. So how do we do this? Let's take some examples as our sort of a guide towards how we can get there. As I mentioned, there's no silver bullet. That the power structure is so much skewed towards the corporations. So one of the things that, as I mentioned, that emerges, you can basically try to encourage, more than incentivize, encourage multinational corporations to adopt corporate social responsibility, spending and investment in supply chains, strengthening and diversity and inclusion in developing countries. The corporate social responsibility is now becoming the norm in the West, especially in the US. So there is a little bit of gathering of a storm, basically by the consumers and the NGOs, about, need to be aware that this cannot be, the business as usual does not work. And I think there is, to some extent, in the new industrial policy coming out of the West, there is this tacit admissions that we need to do business differently. It cannot have this unfettered inequality in transactions and in the business environment. And the way to do is enable shared value with great efficiency and resiliency, empower engaged suppliers in governance, fewer sticks, more carrots for local suppliers, co-investment in supplier capacity, markups, use the markups to increase diversity and inclusion, incorporate standards into international agreements. Now, this is where I think in our region here, we can start sort of thinking in regional trade agreements. We start at home, basically ensuring some of the provisions or labor provisions are included, and provisions for gender are included, provisions for youth are included, and it's debated. And there's a merit for doing so. There's a great traction that can be had in new agreements that you sort of enter, especially this become very effective in deep trade kind of agreements. But I was told that not to have grand ideas by the chairman, but I was going to offer one more thought. Why not a WTO inclusion agenda, if there's going to be around? I think that is ripe discussion to have that kind of overtures, start the discussions, and in a future round, it will be a global round for inclusion. Because now you can't get away from this tendency that all countries now really asking, the consumers and civil societies are asking this question. And the other thing I would say is that the strength of civil society, this is one of the things I particularly think is going to be very prolific and very effective. Just to have the civil society and consumer groups speak more, write more, address this, and act like a watchdog basically to advocate for social and norms and greater inclusion. There are examples I can give you. So there are potentially intersecting avenues and common objectives that you can achieve through ROOT to promote transparency, especially for MNCs. Somebody mentioned about the SDGs. I would say SDG 5 and 13 are crucial. They have to up the game in trying to generate the discussions about inclusion, especially gender, youth, disadvantaged communities, and the work environment, the workplace standards. Promotes transparency and accountability, have like environmental and social governance practices, encourage them at the MNCs, but some of these have to take place at the developing country domain, but I think within developing countries also you can start addressing them. Then there are great examples that you can sort of adopt. That's sort of adjacent to what we are talking about. Things like better work, which is set standards and participatory audits.
I'll have to ask you to.
Yeah, accelerate it. I'm just wrapped up with one more thing. Replicate the scale for co-investment. USAID Global Development Alliance now increasingly encourage inclusion attached to their programs. DFAT Business Partnership, social impact bonds. I think India has done with education for social impact bonds. You can use them for inclusion to a great extent. And then sector initiative, like all the big chocolate manufacturers in the world, big brands, got together with the farmers and growers mostly in Africa, bringing them on with upgrading inclusion and shared benefits, providing more welfare benefits to the farmers and intermediaries. Blended financing for local supply chain development, skill building, I think two of the speakers spoke about, and this is key, the skill building. And driving agenda at the WTO, World Economic Forum, the G20, articulate it in a way that will become very effective. What is the government role? I think this is a very big area. I don't want to get into detail, but there's light industrial policies in order, especially upgrading skill and capacity, basically addressing externalities and market failures. One of the important things I would say very practically, deprive quality inputs to small and medium enterprise through backward linkages. Refrain from doing that because there are a lot of things in South Asia that you can see. I can particularly say in Sri Lanka that sort of tilt a balance in favor of the larger firms than the smaller firms, particularly by design. Avoiding that would have a great impact. Ensure digital platforms as a way of addressing all these tangential issues that I mentioned about diversity, inclusion, and equity. One of the other things that under the G20 mentioned is that are there any data gaps that we need to address? And that one thing I would say, I was myself struggling to try to get a handle of how the indirect impact, the indirect firms or informal firms can be engaged. It's hard to sort of do diagnosis without having data. Yeah, and one way to address this is to think of the enterprise survey, include maybe a section where that you gather small and medium enterprise. I will leave that. Sorry for the
No, my apologies for having to interrupt you, Nihal. You've got such a rich presentation, it's unfair to ask you to turtle, but thank you very much. Thank you. Nihal, again, such a rich presentation. Two things come out of me, and again, we can talk a bit more during the discussion. One is the need for a multidimensional approach with the state, the government, the markets, obviously the corporations who are participants, and the community to sort of be in balance. So they have to sort of work together, no question about it. And the other thing that you said, start at home, charity begins at home. So all the issues we're talking about, can we, within South Asia, do these things? And I'm afraid we are not quite doing it. And I'm going to depend on Dr. Mohanty to sort of give us some advice on doing that. Because nobody will dispute the need to cooperate and particularly, Sachin, I understand you are the author of that enlightened cooperation. The question is, can we stay enlightened through the whole process, not just in the first session of any negotiation? Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Neha. Great pleasure to have my colleague, my friend for a long time in the ADB, Ganesh, here. Ganesh, we've talked a lot about now the macro issues. One thing that we, in India particularly, in South Asia generally, but India particularly, so supply chains are getting disrupted in China, bit of a schadenfreude, so it'll come to India, so it'll come to South Asia. Well, you could tell us if it has happened. My information, my analysis is not quite. So the question is, A, is it coming? And more importantly, Ganesh, given your long experience, what to do about it? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nag, and it's a real pleasure to be at RIS. Thanks to Sachin and colleagues for having me here. And I'm speaking here today as an academic, and I need to make this qualification. I'm not speaking as a presidential advisor in Sri Lanka, so I should say that. Two things I think are relevant as a backdrop to this talk. The first is, this famous Japanese economist Akamatsu who talked about a flying geese model, right? Where Japan was the lead goose in supply chains and this spread to ASEAN. And really, for us in South Asia, what matters is can we get 1.5 billion people into this story of globalization and economic development, right? And the relevant thing for me in that is this very interesting conversation that Mr. Modi had with the US Congress last year, where he suggested that supply chains are at the center of the latest chapter in India-US relations, and the emphasis was on cooperation in semiconductors, critical materials, and e-commerce to make supply chains more resilient and diverse, right? So I'm going to try to make 4 points under these headings, and there is a full paper on the Gateway House and the CAS website if you're interested in these things. So I'm going to try to be provocative and be clear. The first comment is really about supply chain pessimism in India, and is it fading? Now, the kind of anecdotal evidence of this are these really eye-catching investments, right? We've had Apple making the iPhone 14 in Chennai. We've had Foxconn, $1 billion plus investment, right, Sachin, in Karnataka for specialized components and materials, again, for the iPhones. It's linked to this, right? We've had Mercedes coming in making the SQS, which is the latest model electric Mercedes, which they don't normally transfer within one cycle, right? It normally takes 5 to 10 years before they send it, making this in Pune, if I've got my information right. So we've got these eye-catching investments. Now, why is this happening? There's geopolitical reasons. There's the whole kind of US-China competition, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the Trump tariffs, which Biden has kept on, and all of that, which is trying to do this. And then there is this interesting part of India. It's the world's fastest growing market, right? It's growing at 6.7% according to the IMF VO this year and last year. According to the estimate, we've got a low-cost trainable workforce. The point about FICU saying that there's cheap labor available in quantity and can be part of this bandwagon. We've got this 250 million middle class. And we've got more openness. We think Mr. Modi has done reforms, and these reforms will come through as well, right? So that's the first kind of point about why this pessimism may be shifting. The second interesting issue is, okay, these China-centric supply chains are being disrupted. Is China diminishing in any of this, right? What does the data tell us? I am sort of looking at these shocks and trying to understand the data, and I'm talking about supply chains, not value chains. There's a distinction which we can talk about in the chat. So it's really parts and components trade in intermediate goods. And the World Trade Organization has some interesting data which tells us that China and Hong Kong, and I take that as one entity as far as we're concerned, is some 20% of global supply chain exports today. Okay? Now that's down a bit, right? Those numbers have come down and probably will come down more as we go there, but it's 20%, right? The US is about 8.1%, Japan is 4%. The Japanese number is probably understated because a lot of Japanese production is also in the ASEAN region and so on, right? And those numbers are kind of all falling. And the key point I want to make there is China is not out of this game. China is very important and very much part of this game. And the reason for this, even though multinationals are not putting new investment into China, that bit has kind of stopped. But the existing investment is staying because it's very expensive to move that type of production outside China, right? You've set up your supplier base, you have these 10,000 worker factories, you brought all your tech, you're doing robotics. It's very hard to move this kit quickly outside, right? So there is a cost-benefit story about why this may be very difficult to move out of China. Now, within that story of some new investment going in from US, Japan, etc., it's going to Vietnam, of course, Thailand, and these are big winners along with India. The third point I want to briefly mention is India really this complementary hub? And what do we make of this story? And there's a lot in the paper which you can look at. I deliberately decided not to have PowerPoint today, just to kind of give you the highlighted picture. So my take is India could become a complementary hub in this game by reaping benefits of technology transfer. Fuku talked about it, Nihal talked about it, and create value-adding jobs. And it's probably the game that it's automotives, pharmaceuticals, electronic assembly. These are already quite sophisticated sectors in India. People underplay this. And these could be winners in this race. And of course, services. The digitization of services here has been very important and probably continue much more. So this services bit of value chains, which again Fuku mentioned, we don't know much about. And India is going to be a big value in that. Now, the macro evidence, what do we know? So India is a very small player on the export side of supply chains. It's on 1.5% of global trade. Remember, I told you the China-Hong Kong number was 20%, US is 8%, Japan is 4%, right? India is 1.5. But it's on the import side that you see India emerge. India is the 5th largest importer of these intermediate goods, right? So the stuff's coming in, all the important bits you need to make the iPhone, the Mercedes, SQS, those other components I talked about, and it's being done very much for the domestic market. So the spillover has not yet happened. It took China, if I recall it right, maybe 8 to 10 years to get that initial phase. So India is at that early phase, but we're seeing it. And in services, of course, we think ICT will be important, the professional and financial services, transport and logistics. The last point I want to make really is, what can we learn from China for India? Now, this might sound a bit controversial in the Indian context, and I apologize for anybody I have offended that way, but there's a lot we can learn in China, right? China's been doing this stuff for 3 decades or more, and still a player. So there are 4 things that I think we might want to take away from China, which may be relevant perhaps here. We should at least look at it, yeah? The first is we've got to continue to promote export-oriented FDI. This is a radical transformative force. India is increasingly the big destination for FDI coming, partly due to the geopolitics, but also India-related liberalization aspects. And we need to do a lot more, really, don't we? We need to reduce red tape. We need to set up these EPZs everywhere. We need to digitize tax, customs, etc. And we need to conclude these high-quality trade deals that India is doing. So there's a lot around that opening up game that India needs to do. The second part of that question is really about what I call smart business strategies, which we need to have for Indian firms to move into these value chains and supply chains. There are big advantages of being large, and that's a fact. Large firms export. The small and medium come in there as suppliers, but they often come with a lag. And we need to have these strategies which involve mergers and acquisitions of smaller players into large ones. And hey, capitalism is not kind. That's the truth of it, and we need scale. This doesn't exist in India quite in the way we want it, right? So we need scale to compete with these 10,000 worker Chinese factories or 50,000 worker Chinese factories. When you go and see these factories in China, they are truly impressive for the size, the scope, the productivity, the robotics and things of that type. And SMEs can be there, and we have to form them into clusters somehow so they can bear the learning cost of getting there, and we need to have business associations being very important in this game. The third point is really about industrial policy. And old-style industrial policy of picking winners at the detail level, which Korea, Japan, and others may have done, may or may not be possible in China, in India. I mean, China also has a state interventionist template, which is very controversial, but there is a big risk of government failure and cronyism, right? But we need to look really through think tanks, RIS and others, and I hope Sachin RIS will take a lead in looking at what works and what doesn't. But some aspects of China industrial policy I think are interesting. The first is better targeting of multinationals. And I think we need to look at this so that we bring in the right kinds of multinationals, support these nascent clusters we're already seeing in India, right? And I think that's in auto, that's in IT, and in other related sectors. That's very important. A second one is better coordination between the states and central government. And I think we see this a lot in South India, which is why Chennai perhaps has become the Detroit, I believe, of India. This is the word that people talk about. Is it happening in the north? I don't know the answer. I'm just asking this as a, an outsider who's trying to learn, yeah, and understand. And the third thing is the STEM subjects. Of course, the IITs are very famous, the IIMs are very famous, but India's per capita production of STEM subject graduates is perhaps not enough compared to that of Japan, Korea, and even China. If you look at those numbers on a per capita basis, India lags. And I think we need to invest much more in these programs which are necessary. The last point is really about the spread of this supply chain from India to the neighbors. And I think, India would really benefit from having the Bangladeshis and the Sri Lankas as part of this story, because the lower cost labor are there. Those are also markets, perhaps for Indian made goods, as well as there's the political stability dimension. If we don't bring India into this game with the region, there will be a cost to India, perhaps in the long run, if the region is not part of that story. And I think India should do this supply chain game, follow the flying geese model in a sub-regional sense, and I think that's terribly important. So I think we should think of a Make in South Asia program. So there's a Make in India program. It's had its successes. Some people say there's room for improvement, but we need to look at a Make in South Asia program where India provides fiscal incentives to Indian manufacturers to move into the Bangladeshis and the Sri Lankas and maybe beyond. Food processing, textiles, these are the obvious sectors, and maybe even automotives. And the last point, I think, is India really should prioritize strong, deep bilateral FTAs, both with Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. I know a little bit about the Sri Lanka story, which I'm not allowed to comment on here, but I think India should really provide strong market access for those two neighbors in particular. So in conclusion, it's a kind of a glass half full, but it's a glass half full which has definitely got an end date to it, right? But I think we need to do a number of things if we want India to be a key player in this movement in the future, and I'm cautiously optimistic we can do it. Thank you very much.
Very good, very good. Thank you very much, Ganesh. I'm very glad to hear the note of optimism, which of course is why we're all here. I'm struck by, well, many things you have said, but one thing that I find a common theme running through what Kimura-san said, Nihal said, you have picked up, the importance of human capital. We can't get away from the skill enhancement, the investment in people, and of course that will have really major effects on the gender issues that the previous session talked about and Nihal, you alluded to. So I think one takeaway for me would be to talk about greater involvement in the global supply chain, particularly as you move up the value chain, and particularly on the third unbundling, will be the need for South Asia, particularly India, because India is the sort of larger country, the need for human capital, not just the IITs and the STEMs, quite frankly. I think we've got to really start basic. I mean, it has to be from ground up. I think that will be a very important one. The other thing which I found very interesting, Ganesh, you talk about the scale, and that is something which again is a point which we often, when we think about creating jobs and all that, we think about the, what will happen at the ground level. And I think we have to find that balance, because without scale, many of these things won't happen. We won't be able to compete. But on the other hand, there's a whole aspect of rural-urban migration, which sort of has other ramifications. What I'm really trying to say, and I'm gathering from this, how complex this all is. As Nihal, you said, this is a very complex process, multidimensional, yes. And that is why Dr. Mohanty, as the last speaker, will bring it all together for us. Dr. Mohanty, the thing that I would very much like to hear from you is, as your paper very heroically talks about towards equitable growth in the southern trade. So I would like to talk about growth, but also the equitable part. Over to you. Thank you very much, Dr. Mohanty. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the opportunity. I would really focus on the macro dimensions of the value chain, how that really affected southern countries. This is a very large study led by my director, Sachin Chaturvedi, and also the team members, Pankudi Gaur, Amannath, and Dibanjana. The focus of the study is that when we have got globalization and how that has led to this resurgence of South, and if that is happening, then is it that they led by the trade, and if trade, is it that value chain, then which are the sectors being affected? I think the broad issues that I would like to provide. Value chain, of course, we have discussed at length, but if we look at value chain in the trade sector, the classification is very much limited. So this is primarily limited to the manufacturing sector, and less we discussed about the agriculture sector, particularly in the context of trade. Here I just try to show that trade is the driver of growth. You can look at between the trade and the GDP. All the last 2 decades, if you look at, trade is growing at much a faster rate than that of the GDP. If we look at the trade as a proportion or the openness of any country developing and the world as a whole, you can see that developed countries have persistently made very good progress, but that is very much limited with the developing countries. And when you look at South, inclusive of China, a lot of discussion is about that. When you talk about South and you add China, the flavor would be completely different. So if you delineate China from South, you can see the openness trend of the remaining South is quite consistent if you add China. Now, the question is that in the global trade, how South and the North are really participating. It is seen that over the last 2 decades, you can see that the share of the developed countries is declining persistently, and in return, the share of developed countries is growing. It is the recession that has really stopped the process of convergence between North and South. So you can also see that in terms of trade, in exports, developing countries are almost at par with the developed countries by 2020. Of course, it is not there in imports, but it is very much seen in trade. But if you look at the convergence of trade between North and South, where exactly it is happening, if we put them separately, export and import, I think convergence is already there in exports. I think developing countries are at par with developed countries since 2013. There are variations because of the recession, but that is not there with imports. That means developed countries are more on the import side than the developing countries. So if we put them separately, all the 4 or 3 major things, that in mineral sector already developing countries are at par with the developed countries, and the convergence is really taking place in agriculture and the manufacturing sector. So now, if we look at the growth movements of why it is happening between the developed and the developing countries, North and South, see that in most of the time, the growth rate of developed countries much higher than that of the developed countries all through the last 2 decades. And if we particularly focus on the global south, and when people say that global south is not homogeneous, it is diversified, then okay, if you put them in the different segments of south, that is emerging countries without China, other developing countries, transitional economies, LDCs, if you look at that scenario, I think southern surge is not because of China. Without China, also you can say that emerging countries are very balanced way growing. Similarly, other developing countries are posting trade surplus with the rest of the world, and there are some problems with LDCs and the transitional economies in terms of growing trade deficit with the rest of the world. So if we come straight to intermediates, the whole discussion is about the value chain. In the intermediate sector, in imports, I think southern countries are at par with the northern countries. And in recent years, in exports, southern countries are also matching that of the developed countries. So in the whole scenario of the value chain, over the last 2 decades, clearly indicating that the movement is very slow. So global scenario is only one segment where there is some movement, it is in the intermediate segment. And within intermediate segment, you have got semi-processed goods and also parts and components. In case of parts and components, it is quite smooth over the last 2 decades, but it is not that consistent in case of semi-processed goods. So if we look at the combination or the how different groups of southern countries are performing in exports and imports, I think emerging countries are almost taking half of the southern trade, both in exports and imports. Only in case of LDCs and transitional LDCs, the deficit quite substantial, as I said earlier. When we talk about GBC in the manufacturing sector, I think only a few sectors, suppose if you take the HS sections, only 16 sections are in the manufacturing sector, and only few of them are a part of the value chain. And machinery and automobiles, I think Professor Kimura also mentioned, that the automobile and machinery sector comprising 95% or more of the total GBC sector, particularly parts and components sectors in the manufacturing sector. And that is making some progress. So if we see between north-north and south-south, what is the scenario emerging? The scenario is emerging that the north-south trade in the semi-processed sector is declining, and that is and also happening in all sectors, including semi-processed parts and components, in goods, capital goods, and final consumer goods. But interestingly, in parts and components sector, south-south trade is growing, and it has exceeded that of the cooperation between north-south trade in parts and components. In case of final capital goods, I think convergence is almost reaching, but it is not that much in semi-processed and in the final consumer goods. Now it's about the manufacturing sector, but there is no methodology as such, particularly in GBC in the trade sector, that what we are evolving at this point of time, and just trying to see the value chain through the smile curve. And for that, we have tried to identify products coming under the midstream, those products which are production within the farm level, midstream, food processing and retail manufacturing, and downstream, deep processing, branding and marketing, how we have identified the products by taking isolating different products within the agricultural commodities. We have isolated agriculture sector into 12 broad product groups, and then in each product we have identified the products under different segments of this smile curve. And what it is emerging by taking 194 countries at 6 digit for the last 20 years, it is that the mid-term sector is making some headway, but not in other sectors. So the dominance of the upstream is very much there. And I just 2 slides, we can see that when come at the micro level, the composition of the downstream is very less in India. It is very similar to that of Brazil, though Brazil is part of the Cranes group. And US is not very different from that of China or South Africa. But UK, you can see very good in terms of its the downstream segment and also in the midstream segment. So many developing countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, they do pretty well in terms of their midstream and downstream sectors of agriculture. But if we look at all the countries, how they're placed in downstream sector, I think it's highly heterogeneous in nature. I think very few countries having strong monopoly over the downstream products globally. But that is, if you take the midstream and upstream separately, I think that concentration you can find in the upstream sector, not in the midstream sector. So that is the current situation. Thank you.
Thank you. I must say, Sachin, when you asked me to chair the session, I was, of course, delighted and honored. But I have to admit to my colleagues that I'm also apologetic because you have such a rich presentation and all that I keep doing is sort of move on. But it only goes to show you guys have done tremendous work and we look forward to reading the reports. Dr. Mohanty, I must say that this is very encouraging and I must also say very pleasantly surprising. I really personally didn't realize the convergences that, striking. Though, well, again, we'll have to look at your report. The convergence is fine, but what you're also saying, which is even more striking to me, is the rise of the South is irrespective of the rise of China. I mean, I'm sure your numbers are all correct and it's all backed up, but again, just for me, that sort of was quite a revelation. We'll have to see, particularly in light of what Ganesh said about the global value chain. China and Hong Kong accounted for 20%, and so without China, where would we be? But anyways, we look forward to your report and of course all the material, rich material that you have got there. I'm very sorry that we at the panel have eaten up more of your time, but we do have some time for questions from the floor. Keep it to questions rather than comments. If you plan to identify yourself, let's go. Yes, please.
Well, I found this very interesting. I have one question which relates to how we see the global South evolving over time. And if we assume, for example, that China, India, Indonesia basically move up the economic ladder and become upper middle income countries and so on, don't they just exit from the South, and become part of the North? And connected with that is also another question, which is that if we look at the coordination issues that were talked about, we always seem to assume that we have government policy which will do the coordination. But actually, a lot of the decision making now is coming down to the mega cities, which actually trade with each other, communicate with each other much more closely than governments do. And so we're getting a situation where we have many of the mega cities are actually much richer than many countries. Exactly the same for global corporations who are really truly global. They don't have country loyalties and so on. So in this case, how do we do this coordination? How do we maintain this notion of a global South? Or are we in a situation where we should simply forget about talking about the global South and talk about some other criteria? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me take a few more questions. And yes, please, sir.
With the success of G20 here in India, under the leadership of India, more particularly with Modi in the lead, what role do we see for India in seeking the cooperation part of this South Asian cooperation in the value chain in particular, and South-South cooperation in general?
Right, thank you, thank you. Yes, please, sir.
My question is to Chair.
To me?
Yeah.
Well, I'm supposed to just pass it on to them, so yeah, go ahead, I'll take it.
Few years back, eminent economist Joseph Stiglitz came to India and he said that he has, US universities has stopped to study globalization a year back. If we look at India, rather than inclusive economic development, we have created chai bowls without a single brand for the world economy. Even then, why you are singing paeans to globalization? That is my question.
That's a question to me, right? Yeah, okay. Okay, last one and then we'll sort of, sorry, yeah, okay, go ahead and then you.
Sir,
Yeah, okay,
sir, basically,
please go ahead.
my question is basically that, of course, I am very delighted, with the positive trend, for the global south. So, although, data from the Brazil and Latin America countries, that were not shown, but then, of course, especially in the South Asian context, these data are very, very positive, and we will do very well vis-a-vis the China. So that I hope so. And but however, the one thing, that rankles me rather, that, that how we can get north, because when we talk about global south, so there is also a global north. And of course, if you look at another vectors, global east and global west. So the idea is that, that we need to move together, because as we, this is my comment, rather my observation is that there are certain aspects like, which we have not seen the reference in these presentations. That is one of the renewable energy security that I'm talking about. Renewable energy, because India has led Solar Alliance. But then I don't find much reference, that especially how much positive, trends, we are looking into the green economy, because we must be leading in that also. And that requires, a cooperation of not only global south, but also global north. Because, we are very much one together now. Because now we are promoting Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, unity, one earth, one future, one family. Right. So we are one family, so we can no longer play with this, labels. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, last question and then we'll wrap up.
Sure,
Yeah.
Thank you. This is Salim Raihan from Bangladesh. Just one observation is that when you talk about global south, I think we are just, we need to be concerned that except those emerging economies, developing emerging economies, a large number of global south, their performance is not really satisfactory. So we should not really mix it up. So then the question comes, I'm coming from Bangladesh, that a country like Bangladesh and as LDC, its participation in the global value chain was largely frustrated by these ISMs, international support measures. Now that is, one side is the positive, but the other side is that it put the policymakers into such a comfort zone. They are not interested in reforms, undertaking reforms to get into the other products for larger integration in the global value chain. So my question to the panelists is that, how do you really motivate the policymakers? I saw Dr. Nihal's kind of list of reform areas, but how do you really motivate them, even for a country like Sri Lanka, to undertake these reforms? Thank you.
You realize that the question that you've asked, which are very rich and profound, answers to them are going to eat into your dinner. So you're going to have to choose which way do you want. So what I'll do is request my panelists, co-panelists, to take a minute each, sum up and pick any question that you would like to. And if something is left, I'll try to wrap up and, address them, okay? So Nihal, why don't we start from you at that end?
Use this.
Why don't you take that, yeah.
Salim, you and I speak the same language, thankfully. It's a tough question. As analysts and researchers, what we can do is a bit more proactive, because I mentioned this in the last summit we had. If policymakers are not adapting something, maybe it's not something wrong with them, it's something wrong with us. That we are not communicating in a language or in terms of nuances that needs to be communicated. And that process has to take place. I completely agree with you. We cannot run away from this, the elephant in the room, which is non-reform and still expecting to be very vibrant in international transactions. So I think the only way to do is be more persistent, be more innovative in communicating. Maybe find languages to do that. The social media, social media is a very potent avenue to influence policy. Explore everything, and or if not, find somebody like Dr. Vijayanaja, who already has presence here, and present these nuances in a very subtle format, and keep at it. That's the only thing I can think of.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Nihal. Ganesh?
So the crux of my point is that India will over time do better in these supply chains, particularly if we have a Trump presidency coming into being and a greater set of Trump tariffs or even more things. In spite of what Fuku is saying, it may be that multinationals put more investment in India as opposed to some of the other countries. So India will benefit in the trade diversion sense.
Are you encouraging us to support Trump?
No, I'm saying this is a scenario we have to consider, right? But under Biden, they've kept the Trump tariffs, right? So this move anyway is happening. Yeah? Okay. It could just get much worse. And India obviously has to do reforms. My second point is simply that in doing this, India has to do a really difficult thing, which we saw China doing in ASEAN, which is it developed the value chain concept within itself, but it also took its neighbors as part of the process, right? Aided by Korea and Japan, of course. And that is something India has to look at very carefully. And I think India should bring on Japan and Korea in that process, right? So we need to think of an offer of India to the region for why they can also benefit from this phenomenon. India doing it alone, I don't think will be that useful for India in the long run. That's my point I'm trying to make. Yeah?
Thanks, Ganesh. Kimura-san?
Thank you. How to define Global South? This is one question that we have to think of course. But I believe that for many issues, Global South get together and they try to change the world. I think that's a really natural move, so definitely we should do that. But at the same time, many developing countries are having some aspiration to become fully developed economies at the same time too. So those are not necessarily we don't have to choose one of them actually. So both should be allowed definitely. So I talked about Malaysia. Talking about Indonesia, recently a part of the government tries to set up a study group thinking of the accession to CPTPP and also OECD. So actually we got some assigned jobs for the Indonesian government to study that. I think as of OECD, we have to check 30-something committees as a gap analysis and others. But I'm not sure the Indonesia's politics would allow those kind of group to going forward or not. I'm not sure, but that's a part of our aspiration. I think that's not a bad thing at all. So I think so we have to allow both to go ahead. That's my view. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kimura-san. Dr. Mohanty?
One question is related to G20 and the role that the government of India has really implemented in improving GVC. I think the international trade is very low to the extent of just 5 to 6%. But if you dissect between sectors, in the agriculture sector, the international trade is more than 10%. And within agriculture, there are two sectors, particularly fruits and vegetable and processed food, where international trade is more than 13%. So realizing the potential of agriculture trade in the region, Prime Minister Modi launched a major study to examine the possibility of value chain in the region. And I think we are doing it where we are getting the early evidences that there is tremendous scope to have value chain in the agriculture sector within the region. The other very important question by Professor Salim Rehan, that how it has benefited developing countries. If you take out, you said that I would take out emerging countries, China, even and also to take out LDCs and transitional economies, the remaining developing countries, what we showed that they continue to grow with a large trade surplus. But with LDCs, what in this slide showed that not much support from the value chain sector. But we have in another study examined that LDCs really benefited extensively during the period of global buoyancy between 2002 to 2007 and also first phase of recession. The downturn really came in the second phase of recession. So that way, it was quite favorable for LDCs as compared to other emerging and other developing countries. So I am not referring to any specific country, but I am referring to the group as a whole. About green economy, the question raised in India, I think already there is estimation of blue economy, which is contributing nearly 4% of GDP. But blue trade is contributing more than 10% of our total trade in the country. And blue trade and blue economy, they are growing much faster than blue the overall economy and also overall trade. So therefore, these are really stimulating sectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just to remind with regard to LDCs, because I was making the point about the low-income countries and the LDCs in the South. I know that there is a North in the Global South and there is a South in the Global South. That is obvious. The issue is whether the North in the Global South, the BRICS countries, for example, can help the South in the Global South in terms of, taking the value chains forward in an inclusive way. And we are encouraged by India's G20 presidency, the establishment of the Center for Global South, the KIN itself is very encouraging. And we have also the current presidency of Brazil and then of South Africa. So it provides us with a, timeline quite significant in order to change. So this is one issue. And also, Chair, I would like to remind that when the least developed countries were identified in 1971, the number was 25. Today, as we speak, 46. So that also speaks about, the benefits that we had. Only 6 countries could graduate. Total population, 5 million. Okay, so, and as Selim rightly mentioned, we will be graduating very soon. Obviously, market access will not be there, international support measures will not be there. That's why we are now, thinking about how South-South cooperation can help us in terms of strengthened global integration. And Chair, you mentioned the risk that the LDCs could retreat into protectionism. I don't think that we can afford to do that. What I was mentioning was the benefits, how we can have a shared benefit. If you look at the WTO monitoring, you will see that during COVID and during the Russia-Ukraine war, it was the developed countries which had pursued protectionist measures, number being higher than trade facilitating measures. So that is on record. One just point which was mentioned about wages and gender. What we found in Bangladesh is that for the same type of work in the ready-made garments, there is no discrimination between men and women. The problem is that there is a glass ceiling. So as you go for technological upgradation, skills, etc., women are not being able to go up. So now, because of the competitive pressure, we are now having to go for productivity enhancement, and the share of women in the ready-made garments sector has come down from 90% to 64%. That is where I think the inclusive growth issue comes in, how to get women into the technology upgradation process and skills upgradation process. This is very important. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just hoped one of my panelists will take your question, but since it was not, I think I owe it to you too. I think you probably have gathered the sentiment here that we are not singing undiluted paeans to globalization, no question about it. But I think it will also be very important to recognize that globalization has made a big, big positive difference to the world. Just look at the poverty rates, nothing else. Asia in 1970, 1 out of every 2 Asian was below the poverty line. Now it's less than 10%. So I think we all accept the benefits of globalization. But I think it's absolutely important, and I think that's the point you're alluding to, and I couldn't agree more with you, and a point that, of course, Dr. Rahman, Dr. Pitigal and others have talked about, the issue of distributive justice. Globalization has winners and losers. It is a win-win proposition at the macro level, but not only between countries, but within countries there are losers. Where I think we have failed, we, the sort of community of globalists, policymakers, etc., this compensation, of the winners and the losers hasn't happened, which should have happened through fiscal policies, should have happened through skill training, reskilling. So I think that's what we're talking about. And a point that you made, Mustafa, is very, very important. There is distributive injustice. An iPad assembled in China, 5 cents to a dollar stays in China. 95% goes to US because of the issues that Nihal, you mentioned about branding, R&D, and all of that. So that is where we have to address it. But I think the point we are making collectively, don't kill the golden goose. We are not going to be anti-globalization. We're going to say, how can we make it better? And this whole panel, and as a matter of fact, this whole session of the last 3 days is pointed to that. So with that, first of all, let me thank this brilliant bunch of my colleagues who have done a great job, particularly with my sort of time bar that I imposed. And thank you for sort of bearing with us. And thank you very much, Sachin and RIS and others for hosting it. For me, this has been extremely, learning experience, and I've certainly enjoyed all your company. Thank you very much, and a big hand to the panel. Thank you very much. Photo. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair, for moderating the session with such finesse and covering all the nuances that our distinguished panelists highlighted. I now request everyone to proceed to the fountain lawn for the dinner hosted by RIS. For tomorrow, the program will follow the agenda shared with all of you. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.